Hey guys, I hope y'all had a great weekend. I'm going to start by introducing what we're going to be doing in reading this week. We are going to be introducing poetry, and throughout the week, we're going to be reading different poems and analyzing different poems. So let's get started. Alright friends, just like when we are reading a story, we want to think about our reading, think about what we're reading, how are we feeling, what are we picturing. Just like when we do that when we read a story, we're going to do that when we read a poem as well. And as we're doing that, we want to use our elements of poetry. We're going to focus on a few elements of poetry today, and I'm going to introduce those to you. The first one that I want to introduce to you is your senses. Just like when you read, you want to use your five senses, like what do you see, what do you taste, what do you touch. So that's what we're going to call this, is our five senses. The next one that I want to talk about is an alliteration. An alliteration is a word that begins with the same letter. So down here we have an example of one, which is Peter Piper pickled a peck of pickled peppers. So notice how that p sound is repeating. That is called an alliteration. The next one that I want to talk to y'all about is repetition. And that is when a word, a line, or a phrase is being repeated throughout a poem. So in this poem, we can see as we read, I can read a boat, I can read a goat. They are repeating that phrase, I can read. So, words, phrases, or lines repeated. And then down here we see it looks like it's a camera recording, and usually we see these in movies. So this is what we call mental imagery. And that is when a reader is kind of creating a picture in their head, almost like they're playing a movie in their head. So we're going to say movie in head. And there are a few other ones that we want to pay attention to when we are reading our poetry, and that's our stanza and rhymes. And I'm going to give you an example of those on our next page, where we're going to be looking at a poem, and I'm going to read a poem, and we're going to analyze the poem using our elements of poetry. Okay, this poem is called Springtime Magic, and as I read this poem, I'm going to be analyzing it and trying to look for my elements of poetry that we talked about on our previous page. Alliteration, repetition, our five senses, mental imagery, those rhyming words. Just follow along as I am reading the poem. Springtime magic, roaring in like a lion, bouncing out like a lamb. Spring is making magic over all the land, pushing up the flowers, painting on the leaves, warming up the weather, waking up the trees, bringing back the bluebirds, spreading sunny cheers. Spring is making magic, making winter disappear. So the first thing that I'm going to do when I read my poem is number my lines. And I'm numbering each line in the poem, and that kind of helps me whenever I'm discussing the poem. I can go back and refer to a certain line in the poem, so I could say, well, when it said warming up the weather in line 7, this is how I felt. And then we want to underline our title. And normally we would circle our stanza. In this poem, we only have one stanza. And a stanza is a group of lines in a poem that are grouped together. And here we only have one group of lines that are grouped together. Some poems may have up to 5 or even more stanzas in their poem. So as I read again, I'm going to read it one more time, and I'm going to look for my elements of poetry. So, roaring in like a lion, bouncing out like a lamb. When I read that line, I kind of was wondering, well, what does the author mean, roaring in like a lion, bouncing out like a lamb? When I think about a lion roaring, I think that they're loud, they're excited. And when I picture a lamb bouncing out, maybe they're energetic, they're happy. So over here, I'm going to come and underline those. And that's going to fall along with my mental image. I just created this image in my mind, and maybe this girl, I see her. The girl is loud, happy, and excited. Spring is making magic. Well, when I read that, I'm like, can spring make magic? Well, no. That's the author using author's craft and using fun words to add more description to its poem and help you really understand what the author is trying to tell us. What does the author mean? So spring is making magic. When I think about that, spring can't literally make magic, but it maybe might make me feel like there is magic in there, and I feel this magical experience. He's using some figurative language. Magic. And we've talked about that before when it's literal and non-literal. So spring doesn't literally make magic, but he's using a non-literal phrase to create this image and really help us understand what he's trying to say. Over all the land, pushing up the flowers, painting on the leaves, warming up the weather, waking up the trees. Bringing back the bluebirds. When I read that, bringing back the bluebirds, I heard this sound, that consonant sound, that B. And that's an alliteration. Bringing back bluebirds. Spreading sunny cheer, spring is making magic. There goes that line again, spring is making magic. That's some repetition. So we have spring is making magic. Now let's talk about our senses. What do I see? What do I hear? What am I feeling? So I might hear, I'm going to look at my poem again, and I see that the author mentions flowers. So I might see flowers. I see that he mentions birds. I might hear birds. He's talking about warming up the weather. Well, I might feel warm weather. So those are just, that's how we could use our senses as we are reading that poem. So as you can see, I was really able to analyze my poem using my elements of poetry, that alliteration, the repetition, my senses, created a mental image, and looking for the author's craft. We're going to go on to the next page, and I'm going to show you what poem you're going to be reading and how you're going to be filling out a chart just like me. You're going to be reading What Did You Learn at the Zoo? And as you read, make sure you pay attention to your elements of poetry while you're analyzing your poem. And then before you even begin reading, make sure you number your lines and circle your stanzas. So this right here is one stanza and another stanza. So there's a few more there, and then make sure you number your lines. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, guys, thank you.